Good morning. I'm Leanne Shirtliffe. I have the honor of being a guest of honor this year, and I'm going to spell honor with a U to honor Canada. In my memoir, Don't Lick the Minivan, which was published in the U.S., in the acknowledgments, I acknowledged the letter U, which was sacrificed several times in the publication south of the border, which is true. Anyways, this is not about memoirs. So when I was asked to be a guest of honor, they said, you have an hour to do, and a lot of people call it an hour with their name, or you can change it. So I said, well, what do I really know a lot about, because an hour with me didn't sound very interesting. At least to me, because, it's kind of boring when you're you all the time. So I changed that to everything you want to know about children's books, which in retrospect sounds like a really pretentious title, anything with everything in it. So I'm going to talk a little bit, but most of this is going to be a Q&A, because the children's... it's almost like having a presentation about adult literature. It's so huge. And I feel that children's is maybe not equally huge, but equally diverse in terms of genres and subgenres and categories. So I kind of need to know what you also want to know. Having said that, I do have a few things to chat about. So I'm going to start a little bit about my journey into children's books, which was not traditional. I signed with an agent at a conference. I was one of those Cinderella stories. It wasn't this conference. And she signed me for my adult humor because that's what I was writing at the time. And she was awesome, and it was a conference in BC. It sounds like a Cinderella story, but I'd been to that conference several years and had done the work and all of that, and it just turned out, it's like I'd scrubbed a lot of floors, I feel like, and cleaned up after my stepsisters, and then my fairy godmother came, and it was great. And I've just separated with that agent because I'm now, and I'm still really good friends with her. It was one of those, well, you don't represent children's, and that's all I'm really writing, so maybe we should just be friends, and I'll find somebody else. So that's where I am with that. But children's, it varies so much. So here's just some of the subcategories, and we're not even talking genres here. Board book. So I'll go from the teensy-weensy board books to picture books to early readers, which are sometimes called chapter books or early chapter books, to middle grade to YA. There used to be something called new adult, but that's kind of that genre, which kind of spans often university age, seems to be disappearing a little bit. Now, within those genres, you have nonfiction and fiction. You have certainly with middle grade and up, you would have science fiction and fantasy versus realistic, contemporary humor. You have all of that. And they all have somewhat different rules. So it is a big, like I said, it's like adult publishing as a category. Having said that, it is an entirely fun and dynamic and supportive place to be. The children's book community is entirely supportive, I find. I find them some of the most generous people I've met in the writing world. So, given that, here is just a little bit of advice. I feel it's really important, whatever one of those subcategories you want to pursue, that you read heavily in that. And if that's picture books, that's probably reading 100 picture books published within the past 5 years, and probably even the past 3 years. And if it's middle grade, it's probably 30 books in YA. Within that, it's so important to know what's getting published now, because the books I read to my 15-year-old twins 10 years ago, there's a good chance, as much as I love them, they wouldn't be published today. Picture books have changed enormously. The trend that they're getting shorter seems to continue. So picture books mostly are under 500 words if they're fiction. And the challenge of that is you still have to do almost everything a novel does. So you have to have a character with a problem, whose problem escalates, who then resolves the problem on their own without parents solving it for them or teachers, and shows some sort of character change. So you have to do all that while leaving room for the illustrator. Maybe that's why I kind of go crazy sometimes writing picture books. It's middle grade obviously does that. You get more words to play with. So whereas picture books, if it's nonfiction, you can go a bit longer. So you can typically have up to 1,000, 1,500 words. My biggest tip for picture books or board books or is to type some out. Get them out from the library and physically type them into a Word document. See how they look with the text. I have several, I call them mentor texts. I'm a huge fan of create your own conference in your home. I don't think I come to writing very naturally. I have learned, I was a math science kid in high school. I liked English because I like to read. So I come from it with that math science brain. So I kind of take what has been successful and then I try to emulate it in my own way. So I create my own masterclass regularly. So recently I've been playing with middle grade and writing first person. And I noticed I was going I, and every sentence was starting with I. So I created my own masterclass. And basically what that means is I got a bunch of books out from the Calgary Public Library, and I wrote down the first 3 words of a lot of the lines that didn't start with I. And I have pages of them in my notes. And suddenly I got into the rhythm of that. I got into the rhythm of realizing how to do that. I've done the same thing with first lines in picture books because I struggle with that first line. I probably have a file with 100 first lines. The wonderful thing about if you're doing a search for first lines, you can go to Amazon and look at a preview of the book. They always give you the first page. Type that out or handwrite that. You really get the rhythm of what's working and leaving space for the illustrator. One of the biggest issues I see sometimes when I'm open to manuscript critiques in children, and I'm not right now because I'm trying to write my own, is the character needs to find their own problem. There's a reason there's a trope in middle grade and YA about the parents being dead and the kids being orphans, right? So whether it's Harry Potter or basically any Roald Dahl book or so many others, it's easier to get the parents out of the way, the gatekeepers, so that the kids can have their own adventure. Now, I am not saying to go do that trope. What I am saying is that somehow your children, your main characters, and your main characters should be kids. It's hard to have an adult main character. It just doesn't work as well. They have to change and have to solve their own problem. They can have mentors and helpers, but they really have to make their own decision. And partially, it's enabling them. Now, I think there's never been a more exciting time to be a kids book writer. E-books have not really affected the children's book industry at all, for traditional at least. Parents are buying more books for picture books, and I think that makes sense as our society gets more consumer and materialistic, and parents, at least middle and upper class parents, but they want to really, they want their kids to do well, all this pressure, so they're buying them books. Having said that, it's a bit harder to get noticed, right? Picture books is probably one of the most competitive fields out there. It is hard, and I've just had my latest rejected. I get so many of my picture books rejected, but I've had some successes. Middle grade seems to be the area in the market where there's the most growth right now. YA writers, I'm not saying there's no room for you. There is, but YA, it waxes and wanes, and who knows. But middle grade, there's so many agents looking for middle grade right now. As I, remind myself to finish my manuscript and polish it. So I'm looking at my notes. So, yeah, children's book market. I had some stats from 2017, 2018. I haven't updated them, and I forgot to do that when I was looking at my notes for this. But it is an area. I think it had like 3% growth in book sales in 2018, when a lot of other areas were falling back. So it is a good time to be a children's book author. Some resources for you. SCBWI, Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And we don't really have an active Calgary chapter anymore, but it is still worth the membership, in my opinion. Do we? Can you say it out loud again? Oh, SCBWI. It is the biggest international, and it's .org, biggest international organization of book writers, children's book writers and illustrators. It has phenomenal resources. I think it's about an $80 annual fee. I feel it's worth it. It's tax deductible if you're making any income, or save your receipts for if you are making an income later. But they have a ton of resources in a forum there, and it's just a good way to be professionally active. Yep.
We do have a chapter.
Do we?
Edmonton?
In Edmonton, yes, okay.
Yeah, and we're looking for new members. It's pretty small.
Okay, yeah, and I know there is Western Canada is a region for them, and there were local chapters. It's very active in the States and across the world, really, but a lot of the stuff is online, and it's worth it. One organization that's helped me is for picture book writers is 12 by 12, like 12 picture book writers, and they open for membership in January and February. And the goal of that organization is to write 12 picture books in 12 months. But they give such fantastic PD. It is a membership. They have such an active Facebook group that this has been, if you're a picture book writer, I really recommend this, even though it is probably about a $200 charge per year. I'm kind of making this up. I've been part of them with them for years, but you get one webinar a month, and it's often with an agent, an editor who's actually involved in picture books, the Facebook group, a whole forum where you can post manuscripts and people will review them. Yeah, I think they're fantastic for professional, but if you're having trouble finding a critique group, you can find your own critique group through there of picture book writers only, because it is an art to critique a picture book, because back to art, because you have to leave space for the illustrator, right? So that's probably one of the biggest challenges, not describing the illustrations and leaving space for them, and then learning how to critique that, right? Because if we're coming from writing adult or middle grade or YA, it looks like you lack description, right? So, and if you add the description, you probably have a children's short story that belongs in highlights or something similar. But I'm going to stop talking and take your questions, because I think that's the easiest way to do this. I can talk about anything about children's, but I want to know what you want to know. Yes?
And can you talk about how you find an illustrator that suits you? And I guess on the practical side, what they charge is it a flat charge that they take, or percentage of your royalties from the book sell, or how does that work?
Okay, great question. So with respect to picture books, I am traditionally published. So what that means in terms of picture books is that my agent then who submitted my Word document, my 500-word Word document, to my editor, or the editor we've been working with, and she brought it to board, and they decided to buy it. So they purchased that with an advance. Then she becomes my editor, and my latest book, Sloth to the Rescue, is coming out with Running Press, which is Running Press Kids, which is part of Hachette in the United States. So a big publisher. What Hachette does then, what my editor does, is find the illustrator. So I am not involved in that almost at all. Now, I have worked with this editor before. She knows I'm generally pretty reasonable. I'm not going to say no or yes. She did try, because my track record for sales has not been off the charts. So she says, let's try to get you a big name illustrator. So she tried a couple who I would have loved to work with, but they were so booked up. It would have been 2-3 years out, and we didn't want to wait that long. So then she found somebody else who had a bit of a track record, and he ended up doing a phenomenal job with the book. And he got offered an advance, and his advance would be bigger than mine. So you probably know about advances, but if you don't, an advance is like a loan you don't have to pay back. But you don't get any royalties from that book until the advance pays out. So big advances can be great. I would love to get a massive advance. But the problem is you have to sell. It looks probably better for you if you get a smaller advance and sell out. So I've gotten advances for picture books traditionally, and this is probably small. So in the interest from $1,000 to, for my last one was $5,000. So it's probably small in the U.S. market. So, but hopefully I can sell that out. The royalties on picture books are hard because I split them with the illustrator, right? So it's really hard. And then he would have to work longer to pay out his advance. So that's the way the traditional picture books work. And then if, and I have really no communication with the illustrator. Now, usually we friend each other on Instagram or something to try to cross-promote. But if I have the editor sends me his thumbnail sketches, and if I have feedback, then I give it to her, and if she agrees, my editor agrees. She puts it all in her editorial notes, so it all comes from her. And the point of that is when it works magically, and I've been very lucky because my vision is not high enough, is not big enough for that picture book, I think. I think my vision is often too literal. I am not an artist. I don't know the layers of art. Like my first picture book, the Change Your Name store, had no dog in it, but the illustrator put a dog in it, and she added. There's so many hidden references in that. In back matter, there's Star Wars references. You can try to find those in the background, and a reference to Moby Dick, and some I can't even. And I think some to Family Guy or something. I can't even find them all. Their names that she's placed Shakespearean characters. She did some really clever stuff. It looked nothing like what I thought it would, but she hit that book out of the park, the illustrator. She was phenomenal. So the other way to do it for self or independent publishing is work for hire. And even traditional houses will sometimes use an illustrator for work for hire if they more for the mass market or the nonfiction books. So, everything you want to know about frogs or something. And then they'll get somebody work for hire, and that would probably be more contractual. You get X thousands of dollars for doing this book, but probably no royalties or only a tiny bit of royalties over X amount of sales. Did I answer your question? That was a long answer.
I did, but I am curious about if the illustrator that the publisher chooses, in the case that you illustrates in a way that doesn't match at all with words, you have no veto power over that?
You have a little bit. In fact, I found quite a bit of flexibility, but usually the editor will have, and you as the author will have a conversation about styles. So I worked with the same editor. She moved houses, but for all of my picture books. And that's why part of the reason I love my editor, but I also, picture book authors have to be prolific to make a career. So you have to sell to more than one house, right? It's because one house is not going to put more than one book out from you a season. So to really make a living at this, which I am not really doing, but that's fine. I'm fine with that. But you really need to do that. So, the original editor and we had a conversation about even the Change Your Name store, and I said, and she goes, what styles? Let me know some of them. And that's what I've done with covers with editors before too. Send us what covers you like, right? Not so much for picture books, but that was even for like my adult one. So we get a sense of what you're expecting. They really want you to be happy with the covers, etc., and the illustrators. So, I mean, my books aren't really quiet books, probably because I'm not overly quiet myself, and they tend to be busy, a lot going on, so that art style needs to mirror that, and almost more primary color and bold. And so we had conversations around that. And so they were looking for that rather than the beautiful watercolors, which I really quite like, possibly because it's not me, but that would be a mismatch. So you have conversations ahead of time, and the editor would send me 2 or 3 kind of finalists. What did I think? And then she asked them, and sometimes they say no because they're too busy. They can't do it on the timeline, right? So that's part of the game.
You had mentioned books are getting outdated fast. What is sort of, last 3 to 5 years is the most current? What is going out of date? Is writing verse go? What's popular now, and what do you expect is going out of date?
Yeah, predicting trends is hard, but strong characters are very much in. So a character who just is kind of unforgettable. Shorter is definitely in, and I think that speaks to maybe dwindling attention spans, but it also, I think, it's more competitive now, so the writing, I'd say, is tighter than it was 15 years ago. Rhyme is hard to sell. My first 2 picture books are written in rhyme, and there's a few reasons. So all those things that picture books need to do, a character who changes, a conflict that escalates, a character who solves his or her own problem and learns something with a strong voice, right? It has to do all that, and it has to rhyme perfectly.
So more sophisticated story, political correctness, is that an issue that's forcing things?
Maybe. I don't know if I'd call it political correctness, but certainly diversity and own voices. So, not appropriating voice is big. The picture book communities, I feel, in the U.S. is very political. Like they're writing with the current U.S. administration, I feel like there's been a resurgence of the need for picture books because of perceptions of lack of empathy in the current U.S. administration. And I don't want to get political here, but that's, that, is the reality. So, but a few other general tidbits relating to that. Sometimes you get people who say, okay, if I read one more dog story, I'm going to, whatever. So it tends to be shorter, tighter, and voice-filled. And voice is one of those, right, things in the sky. You know it when you see it or hear it, but it's hard to tell, and you know it when it's not there, but how do you bridge that gap? Yes, word choice, yes, all of that. But I find that's where I find typing out manuscripts or the first few lines and just hearing different voices really helpful. And you can if you can start to identify it, you can start to see when it's not there in yours. But that's the biggest problem, I would say, in beginning manuscripts. It just doesn't stand out because the voice isn't strong. In the back?
Can you talk a little bit more about leave room for the illustrator? What kind of instructions you would, if any, you would put as a writer to you?
Yeah, great question. Art notes, we could do a whole panel on art notes. Art notes are, instructions to the illustrator. Have as few, if any, as possible. So an art note that might be acceptable is, for my picture book, Sloth to the Rescue, at Rainforest Rescue Center, because that's not in my text. So somehow there needs to be a sign or somewhere that they're at this Rainforest Rescue Center. You don't want to say the sloth is in a blue bow tie, right? Because you really want to allow room for the illustrator to do their thing, because they are equal part storyteller. Okay, it is when it works. It's a marriage, not of the book and the You're not of the writer and the illustrator and their work together. It's not a collaboration between the writer and the illustrator at all. We don't meet traditionally. It's a collaboration between words and art. And that is a big shift. So most visual description, you don't need to do in your text anywhere. So what that leaves open are things like that can't be communicated visually. Sometimes movement. I know sometimes movement can be contributed. Sometimes like sound. A lot of times figurative language, comparisons, right? And that's where a lot of voice can come in to comparisons, similes, metaphors, all those sort of lovely English things. So that would be a start for leaving room for the illustrator. The other thing I always do too, even though you submit it as a boring Word document, double-spaced, Times New Roman 12, all those industry standards that still exist for picture book authors, but before I submit it, I will lay it out as a picture book. And if you really want my layout, you can send me an email because it's on my computer somewhere, and I have one you can type into, or you can just take an 8.5 by 11, a bunch of 8.5, 11 sheets, and just fold them in half and pretend that's your picture book and write it in. And what that does is it does a couple things. And you can even sketch, like I am a wicked Pictionary player, but I can't draw or sketch, right? But I'm competitive. But I still sketch my little stick sloth or whatever. And what I'm doing, and this might not be the page breaks the editor chooses, but you're seeing if there's enough for the illustrator to draw. So sometimes in short stories, for example, if you're writing adult short stories, one of Edgar Allan Poe's guideline was, have a simple setting, one time, one place. Throw that out of the water for picture books. You want to change settings because, at least, now you don't have to, you're not jumping ahead in time a lot of times, but you really want the setting to be able to come alive, or at least close-ups, right? And we could do another session, and this is something I'm actually not very good at, so I need to mentor text it myself, is the art of the page turn. So you can use page turns for suspense and things like that. I am still figuring that out in my journey as a picture book author. But yeah, so leave room for the illustrators at a little, yeah.
Both the illustrator and the writer?
You certainly can. So typically, and it is not uncommon if you're a new writer, they may ask you, they may still get somebody else to illustrate it though. So you have to be open for that. But you can, and a lot of agents, if you're looking for a more traditional route, a lot of agents want an author and illustrator who's an illustrator. It might be slightly easier to get an agent, but they have to love both because A, they're making more money because you get both the royalties. B, it's often almost faster because you don't have to have that lag time in waiting for an illustrator to agree. So you can. Yep.
What if you contract with an illustrator?
That's harder. So that's easier for an independent publisher. It has been done, but it's less common because they want to bat both out of the park, and sometimes that's hard. What if they love the illustrator, but they don't love the story? What if they love the story, but they don't love the illustrations? Having said that, it's been done. So less common, but it's been done. In the back,
Say a bit more about chapter books and middle grade.
Okay, so yeah, early chapter books are usually, they're slightly illustrated, maybe with line drawings. So those are those thin little books you'd see in maybe chapters, and they're usually in series of 8. They're typically, now you might want to double check this, but around 4,000-ish words, quite big font. And those are harder sells. It's not impossible, but sometimes the traditional publishers will do that as work for hire. But also because they take less shelf space. So they tend to release about 4 to 8 of those at once. And that is because they take up more shelf space then, because they're thin, right? 4,000 words. There are some good ones. I have an online friend, some of my imaginary friends who are picture book colleagues. Marcy Colleen's Super Happy Party Bears series she did with a traditional publisher in the US. And yeah, she has a bunch of series. So that's for them. They are a harder sell than middle grade for sure. Middle grade can range from 25,000 words on the low end. And I think Diary of a Wimpy Kid, for example, comes in about at that low end, up to probably 65,000 if you're into the, maybe a bit higher, but if you're into fantasy. I can't remember what the first Harry Potter was, but in word count, they grew in word count. The sweet spot for middle grade length would be probably 40 to 50,000. Again, you can break that. It's a big area, and you have younger middle grade and older middle grade. So in terms of ages, middle grade is usually about 7 to 12, roughly the age group. So that's what I'm trying to write for. And whether you're writing YA or middle grade, keep in mind that kids like to read up in terms of age level. So typically, a 9-year-old doesn't want to read about an 8-year-old. They want to read about a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, right? Because they want to be big, right? So that's even true in YA, right? They typically want to read about a protagonist who's older, at least the same age, if not a bit older than they are. So you often have a protagonist that's, my protagonist in the middle grade I'm working on is 11, but the book's probably geared to 8, 9, or 10-year-old more. I mean, an 11 or 12 could read it, but really because of that. There's another one right here.
You have a picture book, great, 84 tweets.
Yep.
And it's illustrated by one person, and then you decide to make it into a series. Is there a problem if you have a different illustrator for each book, or should it be consistent?
Ideally, it's like voice, right? So artists have their own voice. So I would say it probably should be consistent because there is recognizability in the marketing of that. Even Robert Munch, worked with, a lot of the same illustrator. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't think of his name for a lot of his books, even just to get a consistency. But usually it would be the same. But having said that, and if you're independently publishing, you have a bit more control about changing that. But typically the voice would, you want that voice and that look to be the same.
Just curious again with picture books, are there any publishers in Western Canada or even Alberta?
Yeah, I am not the best expert on that, but I know my husband's sister is really well published. Her name's Alison Hughes, and yeah, I know, right? Like family of picture book, and she YA in middle grade. So Alison Hughes books, you can check out who publishes her because she has like 19 books out, and she's been shortlisted for the Governor General's. We have great family gatherings; they're kind of fun. She lives in Edmonton. She's awesome. But so Orca's done a lot of hers. I don't know if Orca does picture books though. So well, I think they do. Fitzhenry and Whiteside did one of hers. So they're out of Toronto. I think Kids Can Press still does, but there are. And yeah, so there definitely are. There's a few more I'm missing that some of you might know. Shout them out if you know. No? Okay. Who? Hannock, yeah. Hannock, yeah, they do a ton. There are some I'm just blanking, but you Google search. Yep.
Talk a little bit about graphic novels.
That's a growing industry, and I'm curious in it because I'm kind of interested in it, but I don't know much about it yet. So it is possible to write a graphic novel and not illustrate it. But if you've seen, like Smile is a fantastic one. Some of you know that. And it is growing, and it is, I mean, even I know we're all supporting independent bookstores, but even a walk into Chapters, you see that section is growing and growing, which is fantastic. So I can't talk much about that with expertise.
Do you know the youngest age of would you, when would it?
I would say 7, you know. Yeah, does that sound right? I think that's what I would say, 7 and up. And that's really becoming, you know, yeah, a fantastic market. Yes?
What do you think it's important, or how important do you think it would be to go to one of the SCBWI conferences in LA?
I don't think it's important. I think it's fun. I went to one 5 years ago just because, and it was fun. To be honest, if you love conferences, I think you'd probably get more value for money out of one of the regional conferences, especially in the US. They often have more workshops. So I'm even thinking of like Western Washington. Check out theirs. I've wanted to go to that. Are you from Alberta? Yeah, and then Chicago, there's often one. Illinois does one, and that's a nice little flight. And then Toronto had a great panel, and that's often a good way to network with agents. But as fun as the national ones are, I think the regional ones are more value for money and more workshops, and you can actually get to know people a little bit better. Manuscript wish list, if you haven't been on there, that's a great way just to kind of track, or that you can search for any genre, but you can actually search agents that are looking for certain things, and then creep them politely on Twitter and see what they're looking for. Yeah.
Is that like a website manuscript wish list?
Yes. And then there is a hashtag manuscript, MSWL, but that will be inundated with non-children's as well. For picture books, so Twitter pitch parties are often a great way, and I didn't write down any of the dates, but they're twice a year. I think there's PB Pitch, hashtag PB for picture book pitch, and people have gotten agents that way and publishers. So it's even worth kind of trolling through old PB Pitch and see how people pitch their picture books, if that's the genre you're interested in, because Twitter can be a great place. Twitter for the kidlit community, I feel is a nice space. And Twitter, I know, can be a mean space. So I do feel like my Twitter tends to be really nice, because I unfollowed all news organizations when I realized it was not helping my mental health. And then I opt to see news, opt to read longer form rather than tweets. So yeah, but it is a supportive community. Yes?
I just wondered when it would be wise to use photograph, or is it instead of illustrate, if you're telling a story where you could actually use photograph?
That has been done. I would look for mentor texts on that. So go to the library and sit down and look for that and see how they do it. It wouldn't be typical. I still think kids in the classic, most of the classic, and by even classic, I mean like best-selling and really the ones that last and rise to the top are, another good a couple good websites. Debbie Ohi is from Toronto. She's an illustrator and an author, and I think anyways, you can look her up, Debbie, Debbii, and last name Ohi. She has phenomenal resources for both writers and illustrators and picture book creators. She is just very generous with her time. So I highly recommend her website. And another Canadian who's awesome, she does more nonfiction picture books, which are also really huge. But she has some great resources for writers, is Jess Keating. So Jess, and then Keating is Keating. Yeah, fantastic. A lot of people putting pretty much everything out there. Yes.
You had mentioned, I forget what genre, not another teddy bear book, not another suburban domestic book. How far can a person go with, stretching adventures down to the young age,
I think kids are in some ways so much more sophisticated than we think. And there are some great picture books that break the rules that you think. I'm trying to think. I reviewed it on my Instagram. Ryan Higgins has this delightful picture book. I think it's Ryan T. Higgins. I ate my classmates. A monster ate my classmates. And the monster does eat his classmates, and you see the legs sticking out. And, that's a little bit of horror, but it's funny, right? And I think, kids love that. And I even, one of the picture books I remember reading to my kids 10 years ago, and I'm not suggesting you look this up because I don't even know the title, but it was about a little baby duck getting lost from Mama Duck. And that willing suspension of disbelief that we all do when we watch a movie or even read an adult or read anything, right? I still remember turning the page, and baby duck's lost. And there's all these close-ups in the marshy weeds and, and there's a noise and it's coming closer. And then, and closer and closer. And then, of course, Mama Duck, right? It's the mom. But I remember reading that to my twins, and every time, and even me, you think it's going to be the monster, even though it's Mama Duck, right? It's just like, I don't know, if you're a Pride and Prejudice fan, you watch it and you think, well, maybe Elizabeth and Darcy won't get together, So because you've watched Cullen Firth way too many times, and but we read that, so you can break those rules a little bit, but the one rule you don't want to break too is don't talk down to kids and don't moralize. So agents will reject a book so quickly if you're didactic. So if you're, and this all goes to show, kids are smart. They can read between the lines. My sloth book kind of has some mental health stuff in it. I mean, there's a picture of sloth taking belly breaths, but really, I'm not going to say we should all sit there and breathe when we're stressed. But what does sloth do? He sometimes sits there. Yeah, the illustrator has him in a yoga position and taking belly breaths, because yeah. But it's so that that's sort of there, but that's not the story, right? Yeah.
What do you say the limits are on violence, romance, swearing, and middle grade?
Yeah, so middle grade tends to be more, usually most of the adventures happen within the family or within that sort of structure, whereas YA tends to be more societal, they're starting to figure out, well, okay, I don't know if that's middle grade, what is their role in the family? That's what they're negotiating overall or in the classroom in one of those preconceived communities. Whereas I think YA is what is my role in society, right? So middle grade will often have some rebellion against family, and there will be crushes and things like that in middle grade, and it depends a bit more lower or upper. But usually there wouldn't be much swearing. Or you could use freaking, you could use, but not really. And then that would move it into YA territory. Yeah.
What about a murder?
So I would say the murder would have to, but yeah, you can use suspense in that middle grade, but it would be more the aftermath. Do you know what I mean? I don't think the murder, it would be the emotional resonance or the mystery. It wouldn't be someone being murdered in it. It would be trying to find, it might be finding a dead body or something and then trying to figure out who did it. But there wouldn't have been much emotional attachment to that dead body, if that makes sense. It would be, but again, read what's being published and find something new and see what people are publishing.
What about an antagonist dying by their own hand?
You can try it. I'm trying to think of mentor texts for that. But I wouldn't say there would be a ton of death that way, murder-wise. be more on the mystery side. Mysteries are big in middle grade. There's a lot of mentor texts, but it's more, I think, on the solving. Yeah.
So if I did an animal book that tigers eat people and hippos kill alligators, is that a little much for the younger?
It depends. And I think if you can do it tongue-in-cheek, why not, right? Like, give it a go. One kind of unwritten rule, which I'm trying to think if there's any texts that break this, is you can have animals and people in the same book. Absolutely. There's a million examples of that. But typically only one species talks. So you don't typically, because it's almost like world building. Well, it is. You're building a world and you have rules for that world. And so in my sloth book, the animals talk, but the girl doesn't, or the kids at the school. The animals talk to themselves because, now there's probably some examples that do it, but I'd look for examples. Or you have people and animals and the people are talking, right? Do you know what I mean? So it's just... that's one kind of unwritten rule. Now, again, most of these, once you know the rules, it's like driving, right? Once you become a good driver, you can kind of know what conditions you might be able to speed and what conditions you have to be super alert in. Yeah. I have 4 minutes. Thank you. Last question or two? Yeah.
In series, we have some of the traditional ones like Nancy Drew, Foxy Twins, Hardy Boys. In their series, they never seem to age. Right? Scooby-Doo, right? The whole time. But then you have the series like the Young Wizard series or Harry Potter, where they grow older as they go along. Are both types of series still popular, where they grow older and where it's just the same group doing the same thing over and over again for the person, I think?
Right. So I think that Nancy Drew and even the Warriors series, if you're familiar with that, those are all written by multiple authors. So ghostwriters. So I think it's more typical in situations like that where they're work for hire pieces. And you would have a team of writers, and that's the Warrior. There is no Aaron Hunter for the Warrior series. It's several authors writing in that cat World Series, middle grade cat World Series. So I think it's more typical if you have a single author book that the protagonist ages. We might have time for one or two more questions, if there are. If not, I will release you for good behavior. I do think it remains some of the most rewarding work to do. There is nothing like doing a school presentation, and I work in a K-12 school. I work at Weber Academy in town, and so I teach grade 11, 12 English, but I sometimes go read from my books, and they think I'm famous. It's hilarious. And I want to be an author too. Oh, and then they'll come and show you their books, and they're awesome. And man, there is no other career like this that gives you hope for humanity, let me tell you. Those little cuties. So good luck. And
Books available upstairs?
They are all available upstairs. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, Owl's Nest is a phenomenal supporter. Thank you. Good luck with your journeys.